If you've watched the TV show From, your head is probably spinning with questions right now. What is this town? Who is the boy in white? And more importantly, who is the man in the yellow suit? And what does he want? Well, you're not alone, but here's where things get even more interesting. While digging for answers, I uncovered something that might just blow your mind: the eerie resemblance between the events of From and a classic, unsettling novel from the 19th century, The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. This book isn't just any novel, it's infamous for driving its characters to madness through a cursed play, strange towns, masked figures, and a powerful entity dressed in, you guessed it right, in yellow. Now, I'm not here to give you all the answers to From, because let's be real, that mystery could drive anyone insane. But I am here to take you on a journey through The King in Yellow, a story that might help you piece together the cryptic puzzle. And if you haven't seen From yet, don't worry. This chilling novel just might convince you to binge it. So grab a cup of coffee and let me take you back to the late 1800s, where madness, beauty, and the supernatural intertwine. The evening sky was a canvas of molten gold and deep indigo as Daniel Reeves' train pulled into the station of Ashthorne, a small, seemingly forgotten town nestled between hills that were perpetually shrouded in mist. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks faded into silence, replaced by the distant hum of cicadas and the rustling of leaves in the cool evening breeze. As Daniel stepped off the train, his leather suitcase in hand, he was struck by the oppressive quiet that seemed to cling to the town like a second skin. He adjusted his jacket, the weight of his sketch pad pressing against his ribs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like the aftermath of a thunderstorm. It wasn't exactly what he expected when he decided to leave the bustling chaos of the city, but then again, Ashthorne had not been on any map he could find. It had been recommended to him in a cryptic letter from an old acquaintance. A fellow artist who had claimed this remote town held inspiration like no other place. "It's the kind of place where the mundane bends into the fantastic," the letter had read. "Go, Daniel. If you're searching for your masterpiece, Ashthorne will guide you." The platform was deserted except for an elderly station master who nodded politely as Daniel passed by. The man's eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, as if memorizing every detail of his face. Daniel shrugged off the unease and made his way to the inn he had booked, following the handwritten directions given to him by the innkeeper. The cobblestone streets were uneven, and the street lamps cast dim, flickering light, making the shadows seem alive. As he walked, he noticed the peculiar architecture of the buildings, a mix of old Gothic structures with pointed roofs and wooden cottages that leaned into each other as if conspiring. Many of the windows were shuttered despite the pleasant weather, and a sense of abandonment hung over the town, as though it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Occasionally he caught glimpses of movement behind the curtains, but when he looked closer, the windows appeared empty. The inn, the Gilded Lily, stood at the corner of a narrow alley, its facade weathered and covered in ivy. A brass bell tinkled as Daniel pushed open the door, stepping into a dimly lit lobby that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Behind the reception desk, a middle-aged woman with greying hair and sharp, observant eyes greeted him. "Mr. Reeve, I presume," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "That's right," Daniel replied, setting his suitcase down. "Thank you for reserving the room on such short notice." "It's rare to have visitors this time of year," she said, handing him a key attached to a brass tag with the number 7 etched into it. "But you'll find Ashthorne has its own charm if you know where to look." Daniel smiled politely, taking the key. "I'm hoping to find some inspiration while I'm here. I've heard this place has a reputation among artists." The woman's expression flickered just for a moment before she nodded. "It does, but inspiration can be a double-edged sword. Take care, Mr. Reeve." Daniel hesitated, sensing the weight behind her words, but before he could respond, she gestured toward the staircase. "Your room is on the second floor, end of the hall. Dinner is served at 7 if you'd like. Thank you." He picked up his suitcase and made his way upstairs, the wooden steps creaking underfoot. The hallway was dim, lit by a single sconce, casting flickering light across the faded floral wallpaper. Room 7 was at the end, just as she had said. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door opened to reveal a modest room with a large window overlooking the town square. He set his suitcase on the bed and unpacked the essentials: his sketch pad, pencils, and a small collection of paints. As an artist, he thrived on solitude and the kind of quiet that allowed his mind to wander freely. But something about Ashthorne's silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful, it was expectant, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Curious to explore before night fully descended, Daniel grabbed his sketch pad and stepped outside. The town square was deserted, its cobblestones gleaming faintly under the light of the street lamps. In the center stood a weathered fountain, its stone figures worn smooth by time. He sat on the edge, flipping open his sketch pad and beginning to sketch the fountain's intricate carvings. As he worked, the sound of footsteps echoed through the square. He looked up and saw a man approaching from the opposite side, his silhouette framed by the glow of the street lamp. The man wore a well-tailored yellow suit, his stride confident and unhurried. As he drew closer, Daniel could make out his features, a sharp jawline, piercing eyes, and a smile that seemed both inviting and dangerous. "Good evening," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "Evening," Daniel replied, setting his pencil down. "Nice night for a walk." The man chuckled softly. "Indeed, though nights in Ashthorne often hold more than they appear to." He glanced at Daniel's sketchpad. "An artist, I see. What brings you to our little town?" "Inspiration," Daniel said. "I heard this place has a certain mystique." The man's smile widened. "Mystique? Yes. Ashthorne is full of secrets if you know where to look. But be careful, Mr. Reeve. Some secrets are best left buried." Daniel frowned. "How do you know my name?" The man tipped his hat. "Word travels fast in small towns. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Reeve. I'm sure we'll see each other again." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of a nearby alley. Daniel sat in silence for a moment, the man's words echoing in his mind. There was something unsettling about him, something that tugged at the edges of Daniel's thoughts like a forgotten memory. Shaking off the unease, he returned to his sketching, but the lines on the page no longer flowed as effortlessly as they had before. As the night deepened, the air grew colder, and a dense fog began to creep in from the edges of the square. Daniel packed up his sketch pad and made his way back to the Gilded Lily. The streets were even quieter now, and the fog muffled the sound of his footsteps, making him feel as though he were the only living soul in the town. Back in his room, he locked the door and drew the curtains, shutting out the fog and the shadows that seemed to press against the window. He placed his sketch pad on the desk and sat down, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly. His mind kept drifting back to the man in the yellow suit and the cryptic warning he had given. Unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched, Daniel got up and checked the lock on the door once more. Satisfied that it was secure, he turned off the light and climbed into bed. But sleep did not come easily. His thoughts were a tangled mess of curiosity and dread, and every creak of the floorboards outside his room made his heart race. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were vivid and chaotic. He saw a city bathed in golden light, its spires reaching toward a sky filled with strange constellations. The streets were crowded with masked figures, their laughter echoing through the narrow alleys. In the distance, a massive palace loomed, its windows glowing with an otherworldly light. And at the center of it all stood the man in the yellow suit, his gaze fixed on Daniel. Daniel woke with a start, his breath coming in short gasps. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. He sat up, running a hand through his damp hair, and tried to steady his breathing. The dream had felt so real, as though he had been transported to another world, and yet it was fading from his memory like a forgotten melody. He reached for his sketch pad and began to draw, his hand moving with a mind of its own. The image that emerged on the page was hauntingly familiar. The city from his dream, with its glowing palace and masked figures. As dawn broke over Ashthorne, Daniel sat by the window, watching the fog lift and the town slowly come to life. He knew he couldn't leave now, even if he wanted to. There was something here, something calling to him, and he had to uncover its secrets, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. The Man in the Yellow Suit. Daniel awoke the next morning with the faint memory of his strange dream still clinging to him like morning mist. The city of spires, the masked figures, and that haunting glow of gold had burrowed into his subconscious, refusing to let go. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake the lingering unease as he dressed for the day. With his sketch pad tucked under his arm, he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, determined to shake off the previous night's weirdness. The streets of Ashthorne were livelier now than they had been the evening before. Vendors set up carts near the town square, hawking everything from fresh bread and pastries to antique trinkets and old books. Townspeople, most of them older, wandered between the stalls, their voices low but cheerful. The town in the daylight felt less ominous, but Daniel couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes watching him. "Just nerves," he muttered to himself, stepping into a small cafe on the corner of the square. The cafe, with its rustic wooden beams and dim lighting, smelled of roasted coffee and warm cinnamon. He ordered a black coffee and settled into a seat by the window, pulling out his sketch pad. As he sketched the view outside, the fountain, the rows of shops, the distant hills, his pencil seemed to take on a life of its own. Without thinking, he began to draw swirling shapes that twisted and coiled, like the fog he had seen the night before. The lines formed into something resembling the spires from his dream, and before he realized it, he had sketched a crude version of the palace he had seen. "Interesting choice," came a voice from behind him. Daniel jumped, nearly knocking over his coffee. He turned to see the man in the yellow suit standing beside his table, the same enigmatic smile curling his lips. The sunlight streaming through the window highlighted the subtle sheen of his mustard-colored suit, making him seem almost otherworldly. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, already pulling out the chair opposite Daniel. Sure," Daniel said, his voice hesitant. The man sat gracefully, folding his hands on the table. "I see you've been inspired by Ashthorne already. That sketch of yours, it's quite evocative." Daniel glanced down at the sketch, suddenly self-conscious. "It's just a rough idea," he said, closing the pad. "I'm trying to capture the atmosphere of the town." "Ah, atmosphere," the man mused. "Ashthorne certainly has plenty of that." He leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "You know, not many people find themselves here by accident. What brought you to our little corner of the world?" Daniel hesitated. The question, while simple, felt loaded. "I'm an artist. I came looking for inspiration. A friend recommended Ashthorne." "A friend, you say?" The man's eyes glimmered with amusement. "Then your friend must know more about this place than most. You see, Ashthorne isn't just a town. It's a doorway." "A doorway to what?" Daniel asked, intrigued despite himself. The man's smile widened. "To whatever you seek. For some, it's inspiration. For others, it's escape. But doorways can be tricky. Once you pass through, there's no guarantee you'll find your way back." Daniel's pulse quickened. The man's words seemed to tap into something deep within him, a fear and a thrill he couldn't quite define. "What do you mean?" he asked. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me, have you ever heard of the play called The King in Yellow?" Daniel shook his head. "Number should I have?" "Consider yourself fortunate," the man said, his tone darkening for the first time. "It's an infamous piece of literature, known for driving those who read it to madness. Some say it reveals truths about the universe that the human mind simply cannot handle." "That sounds like an urban legend," Daniel replied, trying to laugh it off, but his voice wavered. "Perhaps," the man said, his smile returning, "but legends often have a grain of truth. Be careful where your curiosity leads you, Mr. Reeve." He stood adjusting his yellow suit. "I'm sure we'll meet again. After all, Ashthorne has a way of bringing people together." Before Daniel could respond, the man turned and strolled out of the cafe, leaving behind the faint scent of lemon and something bitter, like burnt wood. Daniel sat frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Who was this man, and how did he know so much about him? The encounter felt orchestrated, as if the man had been waiting for him all along. He finished his coffee and left the cafe, stepping back into the bustling town square. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a clear blue sky, but the sense of unease clung to Daniel like a second skin. He wandered through the market stalls, hoping to clear his head, but the man's words echoed in his mind. As he passed a stall selling old books, something caught his eye. A tattered, yellowed book with no title on the cover. His fingers hovered over it before he picked it up and flipped through its brittle pages. The text was dense, the ink faded, But one phrase jumped out at him: the yellow sign. His breath hitched. The words seemed to pulse on the page, as if alive. He quickly closed the book and handed it to the vendor. "How much for this?" The vendor, an elderly man with a weathered face, squinted at the book and then at Daniel. "That one? Take it. No charge, just don't bring it back." Daniel hesitated, but the man's expression made it clear there would be no further discussion. He tucked the book under his arm and continued walking, the weight of it growing heavier with each step. Back at the Gilded Lily, he locked himself in his room and sat at the small desk by the window, the book lying in front of him like a forbidden treasure. The words, the yellow sign, replayed in his mind as he opened the book again, flipping through the pages until he found the passage that had caught his attention. The text described a symbol, a twisting serpentine shape that seemed to defy geometry. The more he stared at the description, the more he felt the lines of the symbol imprinting themselves on his mind. He grabbed his sketch pad and began to draw, his pencil moving furiously across the page. The symbol took shape, its curves and angles forming something both beautiful and grotesque. When he finished, he sat back, breathing heavily. The symbol stared back at him from the page, and for a moment it seemed to shimmer. A knock at the door jolted him out of his trance. He closed the sketch pad and shoved it into his bag before opening the door. The innkeeper stood there, a tray of food in her hands. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, her eyes flicking past him into the room. "Thank you," Daniel said, taking the tray. "I appreciate it." She lingered for a moment. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. And if you're having trouble sleeping, let me know. Some of our guests find the nights here difficult." Daniel nodded, closing the door as she left. He placed the tray on the desk and sat on the bed, his mind racing. The encounter with the man in the yellow suit, the strange book, the symbol, it all felt connected, but he couldn't piece it together. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced across it. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with visions of the city from the night before. The masked figures beckoned to him, their laughter echoing through the streets. The man in the yellow suit stood at the palace gates, watching him with an expression that was both welcoming and sinister. When he awoke, the memory of the dream was so vivid that he half expected to see the city outside his window. Instead, the town of Ashthorn lay beneath a pale morning sky, quiet and unassuming. But Daniel knew better now. The town wasn't what it seemed, and neither was the man in the yellow suit. Whatever doorway he had stepped through, he wasn't sure he could find his way back. Chapter 3. The Play's Allure. The pale morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room as Daniel sat at the small desk, the mysterious book from the market open before him. He had spent the early hours flipping through its brittle pages, unable to tear his eyes away from the cryptic descriptions and strange symbols that filled the margins. The words seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as though they held secrets waiting to be unraveled. The phrase, "the yellow sign," appeared repeatedly, each instance triggering a faint whisper at the back of his mind, a voice just out of reach. He ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, the weight of the previous day's events pressing down on him. The encounter with the man in the yellow suit, the strange dreams, and now this book. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, though the picture they formed was still obscured by shadows. The book mentioned a play called The King in Yellow, a work of fiction that, according to the text, had the power to drive its readers mad. Daniel chuckled under his breath, but the sound was hollow. The idea was absurd, and yet something about it rang true in the pit of his stomach. He traced a finger over the words on the page, his mind drifting as he imagined the play unfolding before him. The descriptions were vague, filled with abstract imagery and fragmented lines of dialogue, but the atmosphere they conveyed was vivid. A decaying palace, a lake reflecting a black sky with twin suns, and a masked king whose presence brought both terror and awe. The setting was eerily similar to the city he had seen in his dreams. The knocking at his door startled him, and he quickly closed the book, sliding it beneath a stack of sketch pads. "Who is it?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. "It's the innkeeper, Mr. Reeve," came the reply. "Just checking to see if you'd like breakfast." He exhaled, his pulse slowing. "Yes, thank you. I'll be down shortly." After she left, Daniel took a moment to compose himself. He splashed cold water on his face, the chill grounding him in reality, and made his way downstairs to the dining area. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread greeted him, momentarily soothing the unease simmering beneath his skin. He chose a seat by the window, watching as the townspeople went about their morning routines. Children ran through the square, their laughter a stark contrast to the ominous thoughts swirling in his head. The world outside seemed normal, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something vast and dangerous. As he sipped his coffee, he couldn't help but notice the whispers of the other patrons. Their conversations were subdued, their glances darting toward him when they thought he wasn't looking. He had become an object of curiosity, a stranger in a town that rarely welcomed outsiders. "You're drawing attention," said a familiar voice. Daniel looked up to see the man in the yellow suit, standing beside his table, his smile as enigmatic as ever. Without waiting for an invitation, the man sat down across from him, folding his hands neatly on the table. "I didn't expect to see you so soon," Daniel said, his tone wary. "We tend to cross paths when the time is right," the man replied cryptically. He gestured toward Daniel's cup. "May I?" Daniel nodded, and the man signaled to the waitress for another cup. When it arrived, he took a sip, sighing contentedly. "There's nothing quite like a good cup of coffee to start the day. Don't you agree?" "I suppose so," Daniel muttered, his gaze drifting back to the window. "You seem troubled," the man observed, tilting his head. "Dreams keeping you up at night?" Daniel's grip on his cup tightened. "How do you know about that?" "Dreams have a way of connecting those who share them," the man said, his voice soft but insistent. "Tell me, did you see the palace? The twin suns over the lake?" Daniel's heart pounded. "Yes," he whispered. "How do you know about that?" The man leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. "Because you're not the first to dream of Carcosa." Carcosa. The name sent a shiver down Daniel's spine, as though it had been etched into his very being. He had read it in the book, seen it in his dreams, and now, hearing it aloud, it felt as if the word itself had power. "What is Carcosa?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, but it was a sad smile, tinged with something close to pity. "It's many things, a city, a symbol, a state of mind, but most importantly, it's a trap for those who seek too much." Daniel felt the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, but he couldn't stop himself from asking, "And the play? The King in Yellow? What does it have to do with all of this?" The man's expression darkened. "The play is the key to Carcosa's door, but once you read it, the door doesn't just open, it pulls you inside. That's why it's dangerous. People think they can handle it, that they can read it and walk away unscathed. But the truth is, the play changes you. It shows you things you can't unsee." "Have you read it?" Daniel asked. The man's eyes clouded over, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. "Yes," he admitted, "and I've been trying to find my way back ever since." Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's mind raced, torn between the desire to know more and the fear of what that knowledge might cost him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Because you're standing at the edge," the man said, "and once you step over, there's no coming back. But maybe, just maybe, you can learn from my mistakes." He stood, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Be careful, Daniel. Curiosity is a powerful thing, but so is restraint. Choose wisely." As the man walked away, Daniel sat motionless, his mind a whirlwind of questions. He knew he should heed the warning, that he should put the book away and forget about the play. But deep down, he also knew he wouldn't. The allure was too strong. After finishing his breakfast, he returned to his room and pulled out the book. His fingers trembled as he opened it to the section describing the King in Yellow. The fragmented dialogue seemed to speak directly to him, each line dripping with mystery and foreboding. "Camilla, you, sir, should unmask." Stranger, "Indeed?" Casilda, "Indeed, it's time. We all have laid aside disguise but you." He read on, the words sinking into his mind like hooks. The play spoke of kings and lost cities, of masks and madness. It was disjointed, as though parts had been deliberately left out, but the gaps only fueled his imagination. He could see the scenes unfolding before him, the masked figures dancing through the halls of a crumbling palace, their laughter turning to screams as the King in Yellow appeared. Hours passed, but Daniel barely noticed. He was lost in the world of the play, his reality slipping further away with each passing moment. When he finally closed the book, the room was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The play had taken hold of him just as the man in the yellow suit had warned, but instead of fear, he felt exhilaration. The visions it had given him were unlike anything he had ever experienced, and he knew he had to capture them on paper. Grabbing his sketch pad, he began to draw feverishly, his pencil moving with a life of its own. He sketched the city of Carcosa, the masked figures, and the ominous figure of the king in yellow. The lines flowed effortlessly as though guided by an unseen hand. When he finally stopped, his hand cramping from the effort, he looked at the drawing and felt a chill run down his spine. The king in yellow stared back at him, his face obscured by a tattered mask, but his eyes, dark, empty voids, seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. Daniel set the sketchpad aside and lay down on the bed, his body exhausted but his mind racing. As he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he had crossed a threshold. The play's allure had claimed him, and there was no turning back. Chapter 4. The Descent Begins. The sun rose reluctantly over Ashthorne, casting a dim grey light through the narrow streets, as though the morning itself was hesitant to begin. Daniel sat by the window, staring at the sketch he had drawn the night before. The king in yellow stared back at him from the page, his tattered mask hiding his face, but not the menace that radiated from his form. Shadows seemed to dance along the lines of the drawing, as if the figure were alive, waiting. His fingers twitched, itching to add more details, to capture the elusive expression that he could sense beneath the mask, but could not see. But his hand trembled too much to hold the pencil steady. He dropped it on the desk and rubbed his temples, his head pounding with the remnants of the dreams that had plagued him throughout the night. The dreams had grown worse. They were no longer fleeting glimpses of Carcosa, or masked figures dancing in shadowed halls. They had become visceral, suffocating experiences. He had walked the streets of Carcosa, felt the cold stones beneath his feet, and heard the whispered voices calling his name from the alleys. The masked figures had surrounded him, their hands brushing against his skin, their laughter growing louder and more hysterical as he tried to flee. And always, at the center of it all, was the king in yellow, watching silently. Daniel shook his head, trying to banish the memories. He needed to get out of the room, out of the inn, before the walls closed in on him. He grabbed his coat and sketch pad and left without breakfast, ignoring the concerned glance the innkeeper gave him as he passed through the lobby. Outside, the town was quiet. The morning fog clung to the streets, muffling the sounds of the world and giving everything a dreamlike quality. Daniel walked aimlessly, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind, but the fog seemed to follow him, wrapping around his legs like a living thing, and the whispers from his dreams echoed faintly in his ears. As he wandered, he found himself drawn toward the outskirts of town, where the buildings thinned out and the forest loomed like a dark wall. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Daniel hesitated at the edge of the woods, a sense of foreboding washing over him, but something deeper, more primal, urged him forward. He stepped into the forest, the fog thickening as he moved between the trees. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of moss and decaying leaves. His footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, and the only sound was the distant rustle of leaves. It was as though the forest had swallowed the world, leaving only him and the ever-present whispers. After walking for what felt like an eternity, Daniel came upon a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated stone structure, its walls covered in ivy and its roof partially caved in. It looked like a forgotten chapel, abandoned and left to rot in the embrace of the forest. Curiosity overpowered his caution, and he approached the building. The door hung on rusted hinges, creaking as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and damp, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic, like old blood. The walls were lined with faded murals depicting scenes of a grand city, a city that looked eerily similar to the one from his dreams. Daniel's breath hitched as he moved closer to the murals, tracing the crumbling lines with his fingers. One mural depicted a grand masquerade, with masked figures dancing beneath a golden sky. Another showed a vast lake with twin suns reflecting on its surface. But it was the final mural that made his heart race, a depiction of the king in yellow standing on a balcony overlooking the city, his arms outstretched as though welcoming the viewer into his world. Carcosa, Daniel whispered, the name tasting foreign and forbidden on his tongue. A sudden noise behind him made him spin around, his heart pounding. The door to the chapel creaked as it swung slightly on its hinges, but there was no one there. The fog outside pressed against the doorway like a living thing, and for a moment Daniel thought he saw a figure moving between the trees. Panic set in, and he backed away from the murals, clutching his sketchpad to his chest. He needed to leave to get back to the safety of the inn, but as he turned to go, his gaze was drawn to a small altar at the back of the chapel. On it lay a tattered book bound in yellow cloth, its cover worn and stained. Against his better judgment, Daniel approached the altar and picked up the book. The fabric felt rough against his fingers, and the faint scent of old paper and ink filled his nostrils. He opened it to the first page and saw the title written in an elegant flowing script, The King in Yellow. His breath caught in his throat. This was it, the play he had read about, the one that was said to drive people mad. He should have dropped it, should have run as far away as possible, but his fingers tightened around it instead. The allure was too strong, the promise of forbidden knowledge too tempting. With trembling hands, he flipped through the pages, scanning the disjointed dialogue and fragmented descriptions. The words seemed to blur and shift before his eyes, forming shapes that he couldn't quite understand. His mind felt like it was being pulled in multiple directions at once, as though the book itself was alive, reaching into the deepest corners of his psyche. He forced himself to close the book and stuffed it into his bag. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. The fog outside the door seemed thicker, almost solid, and he could swear he heard footsteps crunching on the forest floor. Daniel bolted from the chapel, running blindly through the woods. The trees blurred past him, their branches clawing at his coat and tearing at his skin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he covered his ears trying to block them out. But they weren't just in his ears, they were in his head, crawling like insects. When he finally stumbled out of the forest and onto the cobblestone streets of Ashthorn, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His clothes were torn and his hands were scraped and bleeding. A few townspeople stopped to stare, but none of them approached him. Their eyes were filled with something that looked like fear, not of him, but for him. He forced himself to his feet and staggered back to the Gilded Lily. The innkeeper rushed to his side as he entered, her face pale. "Mr. Reeve, what happened?" she asked, guiding him to a chair. "The forest," he managed to say between ragged breaths. "I found something, a chapel, and the book." Her eyes widened and she glanced around as though worried someone might overhear. "You shouldn't have gone there," she whispered. "That place is cursed. You need to rest, to forget whatever you saw." Daniel shook his head. "I can't. It's too late." She looked as though she wanted to say more, but instead she brought him a glass of water and a blanket. "Stay here. I'll bring you something warm to eat." As she left, Daniel pulled the book from his bag and set it on the table in front of him. The yellow cover seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, mocking him. He knew he should destroy it, burn it, and rid himself of its influence. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. The pull was too strong. He opened the book again, his fingers tracing the words on the first page. The play began with a masquerade, just like the one he had seen in the mural. As he read, the room around him seemed to fade, replaced by the echo of distant music and the rustle of silk. The world of Carcosa was calling to him, and he was powerless to resist. By the time the innkeeper returned with a bowl of soup, Daniel was lost. His eyes were glazed, his lips moving silently as he recited lines from the play. She set the tray down gently, her hands trembling. "Mr. Reeve," she whispered, but he didn't respond. She backed away slowly, her face pale. She knew what the book could do, and she knew that it was already too late for him. As night fell over Ashthorn, Daniel sat alone in his room, the flickering candle casting shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers in his head had become a chorus, and he welcomed them. The descent had begun, and he no longer had the strength or the will to fight it. Chapter 5. The Yellow Sign. The next morning, sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick clouds overhead, casting Ashthorn in a dim, shadowy hue. The town felt heavier today, as if the very air were burdened by an unspoken weight. Daniel awoke with his head throbbing and his mouth dry, remnants of restless dreams swirling like smoke in the back of his mind. The candle had burned out sometime during the night, leaving wax pooled on the nightstand like a frozen river. He sat up slowly, groaning as the dull ache behind his eyes intensified. His gaze fell to the desk, where the King in Yellow lay open, its pages crinkled and worn from his feverish reading. His sketchpad lay beside it, the last image he had drawn, the King's masked face, staring back at him as though mocking his lack of control. "What have I done?" he whispered, running a hand through his hair. His fingers trembled and he clenched them into a fist to stop the shaking. A knock on the door made him flinch. He quickly closed the book and shoved it into his bag before crossing the room to open the door. The innkeeper stood there, her expression a mixture of concern and hesitation. "Good morning, Mr. Reeve," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I brought you some breakfast. You didn't come down yesterday, and I was worried." "Thank you," Daniel said, accepting the tray of warm bread, cheese, and a steaming cup of tea. "I appreciate it." She lingered for a moment, her eyes darting to the room behind him. "Are you feeling all right? You look tired." "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just a lot of inspiration keeping me up at night." The lie seemed to ease her concern, and she nodded. "If you need anything, just let me know." When she left, Daniel closed the door and set the tray on the desk. He didn't feel hungry, but he forced himself to take a few bites of bread and sip the tea, hoping it would settle his nerves. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, fear, curiosity, guilt, all swirling around the undeniable pull of the play. He knew he should leave Ashthorne, pack his things, catch the next train, and never look back. But the thought of leaving felt like betrayal, as though he were abandoning something unfinished, something vital. As he stared at the steam rising from the cup of tea, he noticed something peculiar. There, on the surface of the liquid, was a symbol forming, a twisting serpentine shape that seemed to shift and writhe as he watched. His breath caught in his throat, and he blinked rapidly, but the symbol remained. It was the same symbol he had seen in the book, the one described as the yellow sign. The cup slipped from his fingers and crashed to the floor, the tea splattering across the wooden boards. Daniel stumbled back, his pulse racing. He wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt, convinced that he was hallucinating. But when he looked down, the symbol was still faintly etched into the spilled tea, as though mocking him. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, pacing the room. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The yellow sign was real, and it had found him. Desperate for answers, Daniel pulled out the book and flipped through its pages until he found the section detailing the yellow sign. The text described it as an ancient symbol of power, said to be a key that unlocked hidden truths, but at the cost of one's sanity. Those who bore the mark of the yellow sign were destined to become entangled in the world of Carcosa, unable to escape its influence. A chill crept down his spine as he read the final line of the passage. The bearer of the yellow sign is forever marked, bound to the fate of the King in Yellow. Daniel slammed the book shut, his breathing shallow. He couldn't let this happen. There had to be a way to break free, to rid himself of the mark before it consumed him. Determined, he threw on his coat and left the inn, the cold morning air biting at his face. The streets were eerily quiet, and the fog that clung to the ground seemed thicker today, as though it were trying to swallow the town whole. He headed toward the market square, where he had first found the cursed book, hoping the vendor could offer some insight, but when he reached the stall, it was empty. The wooden crates that had been filled with books were gone, and the space looked as though it hadn't been occupied in years. He asked a nearby shopkeeper if they knew where the vendor had gone, but the man simply shrugged and muttered something about people coming and going. Frustrated, Daniel wandered aimlessly through the town, his thoughts spiraling. He considered visiting the chapel again, but the memory of the murals and the oppressive atmosphere made him hesitate. Instead, he found himself drawn to the library, a modest stone building with ivy-covered walls. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old paper and leather. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and round glasses, looked up from her desk and gave him a polite smile. "Good morning. Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking for information on symbols," Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. specifically something called the yellow sign. The librarian's smile faltered and she adjusted her glasses. The yellow sign? That's not a topic we get asked about often. She hesitated, then gestured toward the back of the library. There are some old folklore books in the restricted section. I'll unlock it for you. Daniel followed her, his footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor. The restricted section was a small room lined with shelves of dusty tomes and forgotten manuscripts. The librarian unlocked the door and handed him a small lantern. "Be careful with the books," she said. "Some of them are quite fragile." He nodded and she left him alone. The lantern cast a dim glow, illuminating the rows of books that seemed to whisper as he passed by. He scanned the spines until he found one labeled Occult Symbols and Their Meanings, and pulled it from the shelf. The book was heavy, its leather cover cracked with age. He flipped through the pages, skimming over symbols of protection, curses, and ancient rites. When he finally found a section on the yellow sign, his heart pounded. The text described the symbol as a harbinger of madness, often appearing to those who had come into contact with the king in yellow. It warned that once marked, the bearer would be drawn deeper into the mysteries of Carcosa, unable to resist its call. The only known method of protection was to avoid the play and any artifacts associated with it. Daniel closed the book, his fingers gripping the edges tightly. He had already crossed the threshold. The play had him in its grasp, and the yellow sign had sealed his fate. But there had to be a way to fight back, to break free. As he set the book down, something caught his eye on the adjacent shelf. It was a thin, leather-bound journal with no title on the cover. He opened it and saw handwritten notes, sketches of the yellow sign, and frantic entries detailing a previous victim's descent into madness. One passage stood out. "The mark cannot be erased, but it can be contained. The key lies in confronting the king and rejecting his offer. But beware, for the line between courage and folly is thin." Daniel's pulse quickened. Confronting the king? It sounded insane, but it was the only lead he had. He copied the passage into his sketchpad and left the library, the weight of the journal's warning pressing down on him. Back at the inn, he locked himself in his room and spread out his sketches on the bed. He traced the lines of the yellow sign, memorizing every curve and angle. The whispers in his mind grew louder, urging him to give in, to surrender to the pull of Carcosa, but he clenched his fists, determined to resist. He spent the rest of the day preparing, sketching symbols of protection and reading passages from the journal. As night fell, he lit a circle of candles around his bed and sat cross-legged in the center, the Book of the King in yellow, open before him. "I won't be your pawn," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll find a way out." The candles flickered as a gust of cold air swept through the room. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming shapes that resembled the masked figures from his dreams. The air grew heavy, and Daniel felt the presence of something ancient and powerful pressing down on him. As the final candle flickered and died, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer. The confrontation with the king in yellow had begun, and he knew that his sanity, and perhaps his life, hung in the balance. Chapter 6. The town's secret morning arrived in Ashthorne with a sluggish sense of dread, as if the town itself was reluctant to wake. The streets were coated with dew, and the fog lingered longer than usual, swirling around the cobblestones like ghostly tendrils. Daniel left the Gilded Lily with dark circles under his eyes, and the taste of stale fear lingering on his tongue. The events of the previous night, the yellow sign, the dying candles, and the whispers that had filled his room, haunted him like shadows that refused to fade. Determined to find answers, he made his way to the town library once more, clutching his sketchpad like a lifeline. His fingers trembled slightly, and he tried to steady them as he walked. The library had become a beacon of sorts, a place where knowledge might provide him the key to escaping the curse that had latched onto him. Inside, the warmth of the library was a welcome contrast to the chill outside. The faint smell of old books and dust filled the air, grounding him in reality. The librarian, her silver hair neatly pinned back, greeted him with a nod, but did not speak. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps sympathy, that unsettled him. He bypassed the main reading room and headed straight for the restricted section, where he had spent hours the day before. The door creaked open, and the dim light of the lantern he carried cast long shadows on the walls. He searched the shelves, running his fingers over the spines of books filled with forbidden knowledge. Finally, he found a volume titled The Folklore of Ashthorn: Curses, Legends, and Truths. Settling into a corner of the room, Daniel opened the book and skimmed through its yellowed pages. The text was dense, but he was driven by desperation, flipping through sections on local myths and ghost stories until he found what he was looking for, a chapter titled The Curse of the Yellow Sign. The legend of the Yellow Sign dates back centuries, tied to the arrival of a mysterious traveler who brought with him a cursed play known as the King in Yellow. The traveler stayed in Ashthorn for only a short time, but his influence lingered. Those who encountered the play or the Yellow Sign experienced visions of a city called Carcosa, a place of madness and despair. Many disappeared, driven mad or consumed by the curse. Others claimed they saw the king himself, standing at the threshold of their dreams. Daniel's heart pounded as he read further. There have been attempts to break the curse. Local historians documented rituals designed to banish the influence of the Yellow Sign, but none have succeeded permanently. The curse, it seems, is cyclical, returning every few generations to claim new victims. He traced his fingers over a sketch of the Yellow Sign that accompanied the text, identical to the one that had appeared in his tea that morning. The ink seemed to ripple beneath his touch, as if alive. The thought made him shiver. So it's happened before, he murmured to himself. I'm not the first. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. If others had faced this curse, perhaps there was a way to survive it. But how many had succeeded? Judging by the ominous tone of the text, very few, if any. As he turned the page, a name caught his eye. Edmund Carver, a painter who had lived in Ashthorn nearly a century ago. Carver, according to the text, had been one of the last known victims of the curse. His obsession with the Yellow Sign had driven him to madness, but not before he had created a series of paintings that supposedly depicted visions of Carcosa. The paintings had been stored in the town's archives, but after Carver's death they were locked away due to their disturbing nature. Daniel's pulse quickened. If he could find those paintings, perhaps they would offer clues about the nature of the curse and how to break it. He closed the book and left the restricted section, the lantern casting flickering light ahead of him. The librarian looked up as he passed her desk. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her tone cautious. "I think so," Daniel replied. "Do you know where the town archives are kept?" Her expression darkened slightly, and she hesitated before answering. "They're in the basement of the town hall, but it's not open to the public. Only authorized personnel are allowed to access them." Daniel's shoulders tensed. "Is there any way I could get permission?" The librarian studied him for a moment before leaning in and lowering her voice. "You won't get permission through official channels, but if you're truly desperate, there's a side entrance around the back of the building. The door isn't always locked." "Thank you," Daniel said, grateful for the information. He left the library with a renewed sense of purpose, though the weight of the Yellow Sign still pressed heavily on his mind. The town hall was an imposing structure, its stone walls weathered by time and ivy creeping up its sides. Daniel circled the building until he found the side entrance the librarian had mentioned. He tried the handle, and to his relief it turned easily. The door creaked open and he slipped inside, closing it quietly behind him. The corridor was dimly lit, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way down a flight of stairs to the basement. The air grew colder, and the smell of mildew mixed with the scent of old paper and wood. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a heavy wooden door marked Archives. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. With a bit of force, Daniel managed to jimmy it open, the door groaning in protest as it swung inward. Inside, rows of shelves stretched into the dimly lit room, each one packed with boxes, ledgers, and folders. The air was thick with dust, and he stifled a cough as he began searching for any reference to Edmund Carver or the Yellow Sign. It took nearly an hour of digging before he found what he was looking for, a wooden crate labeled Carver Paintings. His hands shook as he pried the lid off, revealing a stack of canvases wrapped in protective cloth. He carefully unwrapped the first one and gasped. The painting depicted a landscape that was both beautiful and nightmarish. The twin suns of Carcosa, hung low in a blood-red sky, casting an eerie glow over the black lake. The buildings of the city twisted at impossible angles, their spires reaching towards a sky that seemed to pulse with life. And in the foreground stood the king in yellow, his tattered robes billowing in a wind that could not be seen. Daniel felt the room spin, and he steadied himself against the crate. The painting seemed to hum with energy, as if the brush strokes themselves were imbued with the madness of the artist. He quickly unwrapped the next painting and found a similarly haunting image, masked figures dancing in a grand hall beneath a ceiling of golden stars. The third painting, however, was different. It showed a man standing at the edge of the black lake, his back to the viewer. In the distance, the king in yellow stood on a distant hill, watching. But what drew Daniel's attention was the man's hand. He was holding a lantern, and the light from it formed a protective circle around him, keeping the shadows at bay. A spark of hope ignited in Daniel's chest. The painting was a clue, he was sure of it. The lantern and the protective circle had to mean something. He quickly sketched the scene in his sketch pad, copying every detail. Just as he finished, the sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Panic surged through him, and he hastily rewrapped the paintings and replaced the lid on the crate. He turned off the lantern and hid behind a shelf, holding his breath as the footsteps drew closer. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept across the room. Daniel pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding. The light lingered for a moment before the footsteps retreated, and the door closed once more. He waited a few moments to be sure the coast was clear before slipping out of the archives and back into the corridor. His mind raced as he made his way back to the inn, clutching his sketch pad tightly. Back in his room, he spread out his sketches and notes, comparing them to what he had learned from the books and the paintings. The protective circle, the lantern, they were symbols of hope, of resistance against the darkness of Carcosa. But how could he use them to break the curse? As night fell, Daniel lit a candle and stared at the sketch of the man by the lake, his thoughts swirling. He was closer to the truth, but the final piece of the puzzle eluded him. The king in yellow was waiting, and time was running out. With a deep breath, he whispered to himself, "I'll find a way. I have to." Chapter 7. The Masquerade. The air in Ashthorne felt different that evening, charged with an electric tension that Daniel couldn't shake. The sun had set behind the hills, leaving the sky painted in hues of purple and crimson as twilight surrendered to the oncoming night. As he walked through the dimly lit streets, he felt as if the town were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. In his pocket, Daniel's fingers traced the edges of the invitation he had found, slipped under his door earlier that day. The envelope had been sealed with wax, imprinted with the same twisting serpentine shape of the yellow sign. The sight of it had sent a chill down his spine, but curiosity and the hope that the masquerade would provide answers overpowered his fear. The note inside had been brief. "You are cordially invited to the annual masquerade ball. Come as you are, but wear your mask well. Tonight, secrets will be revealed." The location was listed as the abandoned Ashthorne Manor on the outskirts of town, a crumbling estate that Daniel had passed by during one of his walks, but had never dared to explore. Now, the prospect of entering its decaying halls filled him with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He arrived at the manor just as the first stars began to dot the sky. The building loomed before him, its once grand facade now covered in ivy and cracked stone. The iron gates creaked as he pushed them open, and he followed the overgrown path to the entrance, where flickering lanterns cast ghostly shadows across the courtyard. A pair of figures stood by the front door, their faces obscured by elaborate masks, one a fox, the other a raven. Without a word, they opened the doors for him, and Daniel stepped inside. The interior of the manor was both decayed and magnificent. The grand foyer was dimly lit by chandeliers whose crystals shimmered like dying stars. The scent of aged wood and mildew mixed with something sweet and intoxicating, like flowers left to wilt. Music drifted through the air, a haunting melody played on violins, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices. Daniel accepted a mask handed to him by one of the masked attendants near the entrance. It was a simple golden half mask that covered the top portion of his face, leaving his mouth exposed. He tied the ribbons behind his head and took a deep breath before stepping into the ballroom. The scene before him was surreal. Dozens of guests, all wearing masks of various designs, some elegant, others grotesque, danced and mingled beneath a ceiling painted with faded constellations. Their laughter echoed off the walls, but there was something off about it, as if the joy were forced, a thin veneer covering something darker. Daniel moved through the crowd, his senses on high alert. He scanned the room for familiar faces, but saw none. The guests seemed to glide across the floor like phantoms, their movements synchronized with the eerie music. He caught snippets of conversations as he passed, but the words made little sense. Fragments of poetry, cryptic phrases, and references to things he didn't understand. The stars are aligning tonight. Have you seen the reflection in the black lake? The king watches from his throne, always. He shivered and pulled his coat tighter around himself. The heat from the crowd did nothing to warm him. Instead, it seemed to sap the warmth from his body, leaving him cold and clammy. A woman in a silver mask approached him, her gown shimmering like moonlight. She held out a glass of wine, her eyes glinting behind the mask. "You look lost," she said, her voice soft but carrying an edge of amusement. "I'm just observing," Daniel replied, accepting the glass. "Observing can be dangerous here," she said, leaning in closer. "Sometimes it's better to blend in." She brushed past him, disappearing into the crowd before he could respond. Daniel took a sip of the wine, the taste sweet and sharp, leaving a strange aftertaste on his tongue. He set the glass down on a nearby table and continued his search. At the far end of the ballroom, he spotted a doorway partially hidden behind a velvet curtain. Without hesitation, he slipped through it, leaving the noise and chaos of the ball behind. The corridor beyond was dark and narrow, the air cooler and tinged with the scent of damp stone. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way deeper into the manor. He passed rooms filled with forgotten relics, antique furniture draped in dust-covered sheets, portraits of long-dead residents whose eyes seemed to follow him as he walked by. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the music from the ballroom. At the end of the corridor, he found a door slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside what appeared to be a study. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp on the desk, casting flickering shadows across the walls lined with bookshelves. In the center of the room stood a figure in a yellow robe, their back to Daniel. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was eerily still, as if carved from stone. Slowly they turned, revealing a mask, not the ornate kind worn by the guests at the ball, but a plain, tattered mask that covered the entire face. It was the same mask he had drawn countless times in his sketches, the mask of the king in yellow. Daniel's legs trembled, but he forced himself to stay rooted in place. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, before speaking in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "You sought me out, didn't you?" the figure said. Daniel swallowed hard. "I need answers." "Answers come at a price," the king said, stepping closer. "Are you willing to pay it?" The air between them felt heavy, suffused with an energy that made it difficult to breathe. Daniel's mind raced, but he knew he had no choice. He had come too far to turn back now. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The king extended a gloved hand, palm up. "Then give me your fear, relinquish it, and I will show you what you seek." Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding. The thought of surrendering his fear was both liberating and terrifying. But fear had controlled him for too long, binding him to a cycle of nightmares and obsession. He took a deep breath and reached out, placing his hand in the king's. The moment their hands touched, the room dissolved around him. The walls melted into shadows, the floor disappeared beneath his feet, and he was falling through a void filled with swirling colors and distant stars. The sound of rushing wind filled his ears, and his body felt weightless, untethered from the physical world. When the sensation of falling ceased, he found himself standing on the shores of a black lake, its surface like polished obsidian reflecting a sky filled with twin suns. The city of Carcosa loomed in the distance, its spires twisting into impossible shapes. Daniel turned and saw the king standing beside him, their mask gleaming in the pale light. "This is what lies beyond the veil," the king said, their voice reverberating like a chorus of whispers. "The truth you sought, but beware. Truth is a double-edged sword. As Daniel gazed at the alien landscape, he felt both awe and dread. The city was beautiful in its grotesqueness, a place that defied logic and reason. He could hear the faint echoes of laughter and sobbing carried by the wind, as if the city itself were alive. "Why me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why was I chosen?" The king tilted their head. "You weren't chosen. You chose yourself when you opened the book and traced the yellow sign. Curiosity is a powerful force, and once awakened, it is not easily silenced." Daniel's knees buckled and he sank to the ground. The weight of the knowledge pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. But amid the despair, a spark of defiance flickered within him. "There has to be a way to end this," he said, "to break the curse." The king was silent for a moment before answering. "Perhaps, but the answer lies within you. The question is, are you willing to confront it?" The wind picked up and the sands of the lake's shore swirled around him. The vision of Carcosa began to blur, fading into darkness. When Daniel opened his eyes, he was back in the study, lying on the floor. The oil lamp flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. The king was gone, but the weight of their presence lingered like a phantom touch. Breathing heavily, Daniel pushed himself to his feet. His hand trembled as he retrieved his sketch pad and quickly sketched the final image of the king by the lake. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had a direction, a way forward. And as he left the study and rejoined the masquerade, he knew that the final confrontation was drawing near. The king had shown him the truth, but now it was up to him to wield it. Chapter 8. The Unraveling. The fog hung thick over Ashthorn, veiling the town in an oppressive blanket of grey. Dawn had broken, but the sunlight struggled to pierce the heavy mist, casting only a pale, anemic glow over the cobblestone streets. Daniel stumbled back to the Gilded Lily, his mind racing and his heart pounding after the events of the masquerade. The image of the king in yellow standing by the shores of the Black Lake haunted him, replaying over and over like a broken record in his head. Once inside his room, he locked the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily. His clothes were damp from the morning mist, clinging uncomfortably to his skin, but he barely noticed. His sketchpad lay on the desk where he had left it, filled with drawings of the yellow sign, the masked figures, and the visions of Carcosa that refused to release their hold on him. He sat down and flipped through the pages, his hands trembling as he traced the lines of the king's mask in one of his sketches. Each image seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the act of drawing them had imbued them with some dark energy. The lantern flickered weakly on the desk, casting distorted shadows across the walls. "This has to end," Daniel whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. He knew he was on the verge of losing his mind, but there was still a sliver of hope buried deep within him, hope that he could find a way to break free before Carcosa consumed him entirely. But as he sat there, the line between reality and hallucination continued to blur. The walls of the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. The faint sound of whispers filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the voices were inside his head, impossible to block out. "We all have laid aside disguise, but you." "The truth is a curse, Daniel. The king watches from his throne." With a cry of frustration, he grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the flames sputtering out and plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and Daniel collapsed onto the bed, his chest heaving as tears streamed down his face. Then, from the darkness, a new sound emerged, a soft, rhythmic tapping. He froze, his breath hitching. The sound was coming from the window. Slowly, he turned his head, his heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the rest of the world. The tapping continued, deliberate and insistent. Summoning what little courage he had left, Daniel crept toward the window and pulled back the curtain. The fog outside pressed against the glass, like a living entity, obscuring most of the view. But there, just beyond the window, stood a figure in a tattered yellow robe. Its face was hidden behind the familiar mask, but Daniel didn't need to see its eyes to know who it was. The king in yellow raised a hand and tapped the glass again, its gloved fingers leaving faint smudges on the pane. Daniel stumbled backward, his legs giving out as he collapsed onto the floor. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice cracking. But the king didn't move. It stood perfectly still, as if waiting for him to open the window and invite it inside. Desperate, Daniel scrambled to his feet and grabbed his coat. He couldn't stay here, not with the king watching him. He shoved his sketch pad and the cursed book into his bag and fled the room, ignoring the innkeeper's concerned shout as he burst through the front door and into the foggy streets. He had no destination in mind, only the primal urge to escape. The fog wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud, muffling the sound of his footsteps as he ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one clouding the air in front of him. The streets of Ashthorn were deserted, the town eerily silent. As he passed the market square, he heard the faint echo of laughter, high-pitched and childlike, but distorted as if filtered through water. He skidded to a stop and looked around, his eyes darting from one shadowy corner to the next. The laughter grew louder, and he saw a movement near one of the abandoned stalls. A small child in a tattered dress emerged from the fog, her face obscured by a porcelain mask painted with a permanent smile. She held a toy lantern in one hand, its dim light flickering as she skipped toward him. "Do you want to play with us?" she asked, her voice sweet but hollow. Daniel took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run. But before he could move, more children appeared from the fog, each one wearing a different mask, a fox, a rabbit, a bird. They formed a circle around him, their laughter echoing eerily in the mist. "Stay away!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. The children giggled and danced around him, their movements disjointed and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. He tried to push through them, but their small hands gripped his coat, holding him in place. "You can't leave," the girl in the porcelain mask whispered. "The king has chosen you." Panic surged through Daniel, and he thrashed against their grip. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a vortex, and the children's laughter morphed into a cacophony of whispers. Suddenly, a blinding light pierced through the fog, and the children released him, retreating into the shadows. Daniel shielded his eyes and turned toward the source of the light. A figure emerged, holding a lantern similar to the one he had seen in Carver's painting. "Follow me," the figure said, their voice firm but kind. Without hesitation, Daniel stumbled toward them, the light from the lantern cutting through the fog like a knife. As they walked, the whispers faded, and the oppressive weight pressing down on his chest began to lift. The figure led him through a narrow alley and into a small clearing behind the town's chapel. The fog dissipated slightly, revealing the worn stone walls of the chapel and the overgrown garden surrounding it. The figure lowered the lantern, and Daniel saw their face, an elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered expression. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A friend," the man replied. "Someone who knows what you're going through. I once bore the mark of the yellow sign, just like you." Daniel's eyes widened. "You survived? How?" The man gestured for him to sit on a nearby bench, and Daniel collapsed onto it, his legs barely able to support him. The man sat beside him, setting the lantern on the ground between them. "I survived because I learned that the king's power thrives on fear and surrender," the man said. "It feeds on those who give in to it, but there is a way to resist, to break free." "How?" Daniel asked, desperation seeping into his voice. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved amulet. The symbol etched into it was similar to the yellow sign, but subtly different, its curves and angles forming a protective shape instead of a curse. "This symbol was created by those who fought the king long ago," the man explained. "It won't destroy him, but it can shield you from his influence long enough for you to regain control of your mind." Daniel took the amulet, its cool surface comforting against his skin. "What do I need to do?" "You need to confront the king directly," the man said, his expression grave. "Reject him. Deny his power over you. The amulet will help you resist, but the rest is up to you. You have to believe that you have the strength to break free." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. "Where do I find him?" The man stood and pointed toward the distant hills beyond the town. "The ruins of the old theatre. That's where it began, and that's where it will end." As Daniel stood clutching the amulet tightly, the man placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, the king is a master of deception. He will try to twist your thoughts and make you doubt yourself. Don't listen to him. Trust in yourself." With those parting words, Daniel set off toward the hills, the weight of the amulet grounding him as he prepared for the final confrontation. The fog thinned as he walked, and for the first time in days he felt a glimmer of hope. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The trek to the old theatre on the outskirts of Ashthorne was both physically and mentally exhausting. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the skeletal trees that lined the dirt path leading to the hilltop where the ruins lay. Daniel gripped the protective amulet in his hand, the carved surface warm against his palm as if it pulsed with its own heartbeat. His breath formed clouds in the crisp evening air, and with each step he felt the weight of the confrontation ahead pressing heavier on his shoulders. The ruins of the theatre emerged from the mist like a forgotten relic from another era, its once grand stone walls now crumbling under the weight of time. Vines crept along the cracked facade, and sections of the roof had collapsed, exposing the interior to the darkening sky. The wind whistled through the gaps in the stone, carrying with it the faint echo of whispers that sent chills down Daniel's spine. He stood at the entrance, his heart pounding. The doorway loomed before him like a mouth ready to swallow him whole, but he didn't hesitate. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the threshold and stepped inside. The interior of the theatre was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decaying stone. Rows of broken seats stretched out before him, their velvet cushions torn and covered in dust. The stage, once a place of performance and art, was now a desolate platform shadowed by crumbling beams. Daniel made his way down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing softly. As he reached the stage, he noticed a figure standing at its center, illuminated by a single beam of moonlight that filtered through a hole in the ceiling. The figure wore the tattered yellow robe, its mask gleaming faintly in the dim light. The king in yellow. Daniel's breath hitched, but he forced himself to remain calm. The amulet pulsed in his hand, a steady reminder that he was not powerless. "You've come a long way," the king said, his voice smooth and resonant. "But you didn't have to. I would have found you eventually." "I'm not running anymore," Daniel replied, stepping closer to the stage. His voice was steadier than he had expected. "I'm here to end this." The king tilted his head as if amused. "End what exactly?" "This isn't something you can end, Daniel. The truth of Carcosa isn't something you can simply walk away from." Daniel climbed onto the stage, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. He kept his gaze locked on the king, refusing to be intimidated by the figure's imposing presence. "The truth you offer is a lie," Daniel said. "You twist reality, manipulate it until people can't tell what's real and what isn't. You feed on fear and confusion. But I know who I am. I know what's real." The king took a step closer, the folds of his yellow robe rustling like dried leaves. "And what is real, Daniel?" "The world you came from, with its mundane routines and shallow pursuits. Or the world you've glimpsed, the world of Carcosa, where secrets are laid bare and the boundaries of existence are shattered." "Carcosa is a trap," Daniel said, tightening his grip on the amulet. "It promises enlightenment but delivers madness. I won't let you drag me down with you." The king chuckled, a sound that reverberated through the empty theatre like distant thunder. "You misunderstand, Daniel. I don't drag anyone anywhere. You came to me of your own free will. You read the book, traced the yellow sign, and now you stand here, on the cusp of understanding everything." Daniel's mind raced, memories of the past few days flooding back. The cursed book, the visions, the descent into madness. But amidst the chaos, he clung to the image of the man who had given him the amulet, the man who had survived. "You say I chose this," Daniel said, taking another step forward. "But I can choose to leave. I can choose to reject you." The king's posture stiffened, and for the first time, a hint of tension entered his voice. "You think it's that simple? Rejecting me won't erase what you've seen. Carcosa will always be a part of you." "Maybe," Daniel admitted, "but it doesn't have to control me." He raised the amulet, its carved symbol glowing faintly in the moonlight. The king took a step back, the glow reflecting off his mask like firelight on water. "You're afraid," Daniel said, a spark of confidence igniting within him. "This symbol, it's not just protection, it's power. It's a reminder that fear isn't permanent. I may have been afraid before, but not anymore." The king's mask seemed to darken, the once glimmering surface turning dull and lifeless. The shadows around him grew longer, swirling like a living entity desperate to consume the light. "You cannot defeat me," the king said, his voice now strained. "I am eternal." "Then you'll be eternal without me," Daniel replied. He closed his eyes, focusing on the warmth of the amulet and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He imagined the connection between himself and the king, the thread of influence that had tethered him to Carcosa, and visualized cutting it, severing the bond. The whispers that had plagued him for days grew louder, desperate and frantic, but Daniel didn't waver. He held his ground, the light from the amulet growing brighter until it bathed the entire stage in a golden glow. "No!" the king roared, his voice distorting into a cacophony of screams. Daniel opened his eyes just as the king lunged at him, but the light from the amulet flared, creating a barrier between them. The king's hand stopped inches from Daniel's chest, the energy crackling like static electricity. With a final determined push, Daniel thrust the amulet forward, and the light exploded outward, engulfing the stage and the entire theatre in a blinding radiance. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath them cracked as the force of the light tore through the fabric of the theatre, unraveling the shadows that had taken root within its decaying walls. The king let out one final scream before dissolving into a cloud of black mist, which swirled violently before being sucked into the void left by the collapsing shadows. The echoes of his voice faded, leaving only silence. Daniel fell to his knees, the amulet slipping from his hand and landing softly on the wooden floor. The glow around him dimmed, and the theatre returned to its state of ruin, but the oppressive weight that had clung to him was gone. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, catching his breath and letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. When he finally stood, his legs were weak, but his mind was clear for the first time in days. The exit beckoned, and Daniel made his way back down the aisle, stepping over broken debris and shattered wood. As he pushed open the heavy doors and stepped outside, he was greeted by the cool night air and a sky filled with stars. The fog had lifted, and the town of Ashthorn lay quiet and peaceful below. The weight of the curse had lifted, and with it, the whispers that had once haunted him. He clutched the amulet one last time before slipping it into his pocket. He knew the memory of Carcosa would never completely leave him, but it no longer held the power to control him. As he walked back toward the Gilded Lily, he felt the first hint of dawn creeping over the horizon, its warm light promising a new beginning. Daniel had survived, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he believed that survival was enough. Chapter 10. The Choice. The early morning sun peeked over the hills surrounding Ashthorn, casting golden light over the dew-covered grass and rooftops. The town, usually suffocated under a blanket of fog, was illuminated as if welcoming a new dawn, a rare reprieve from its haunting atmosphere. Daniel walked slowly through the quiet streets, his shoes scuffing the cobblestones with each step. His body was weary, but his mind was clear for the first time in days. The confrontation with the king in yellow had left him physically drained but spiritually renewed. The amulet in his pocket still pulsed faintly, a comforting warmth that reminded him he had survived. He had done what so many others before him could not. He had faced the king and rejected him. The cursed pull of Carcosa had been severed, and though its shadow still lingered at the edges of his mind, it no longer controlled him. As he passed by the Gilded Lily, the innkeeper stood outside sweeping the front steps. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she quickly put down the broom. "Mr. Reeve," she called, hurrying toward him. "Thank goodness, I was worried about you. You left in such a hurry yesterday. Are you all right?" Daniel managed a tired smile. "I'm fine now. I just needed some time to figure things out." She studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing. "You look better, but you should rest. You've been through a lot, haven't you?" "More than I expected," he admitted. "But it's over now." Her eyes softened with relief. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know. Breakfast is still being served if you're hungry." "Thank you," Daniel said. "I'll come by later." He continued walking, his destination uncertain. The streets were empty, as if the town itself was still recovering from the weight of the curse. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees lining the path to the town square, where the fountain's gentle trickle broke the silence. Daniel sat on the edge of the fountain, his reflection rippling in the water. The memories of the past week played like a film reel in his mind. The cursed book, the visions of Carcosa, the masquerade, and the final confrontation at the ruined theatre. He had come dangerously close to losing himself, but he had emerged on the other side. Now, the question that lingered was what to do next. He pulled out the sketch pad from his bag and flipped through the pages. The drawings that had once haunted him now felt like relics of a life he had left behind. The image of the king in yellow, his tattered mask obscuring his face, no longer made his heart race with fear. Instead, it served as a reminder of what he had overcome. As he turned the pages, he found the sketch of the protective circle and the lantern, the image that had saved him. It was a symbol of hope, a beacon of light in the darkness. He traced the lines with his finger, the texture of the pencil marks grounding him in reality. "What now?" he whispered to himself. The answer wasn't immediate, but he knew it was there, buried beneath the layers of fear and survival. He couldn't stay in Ashthorn. The town held too many memories, too many ghosts, but he also couldn't return to the life he had left behind, not after everything he had experienced. The knowledge of Carcosa would always be with him, but it didn't have to define him. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Daniel. He looked up and saw the elderly man who had given him the amulet standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. The man's expression was serene, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that made Daniel feel as though he were looking into a mirror. "I was wondering if I'd see you again," Daniel said. The man approached and sat beside him on the edge of the fountain. "I had a feeling you would make it through. You had the resolve." "I almost didn't," Daniel admitted, staring at the ripples in the water. "There were moments when I thought I was done for." "That's how the king works," the man said. "He pushes you to the edge, makes you question everything, but you fought back, and that's what matters." Daniel hesitated before asking, "Did you ever feel normal again, after you broke free?" The man exhaled, his breath forming a faint cloud in the cool morning air. "Normal is a tricky thing. You'll never be the same person you were before, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The key is finding a way to live with what you've seen and learned. Use it to create something meaningful." "Meaningful," Daniel repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a foreign concept. He thought of his art, the sketches he had created before the curse had taken hold of him. Back then, he had been searching for inspiration, for something that would make his work stand out. Now, he had a story unlike any other, one that could be told through his art. "Maybe you're right," Daniel said. "Maybe I can turn this into something worth sharing. But how do I start? How do I move on?" The man placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "One step at a time, leave Ashthorn, travel, let the world show you its beauty again, and when you're ready, create. Tell your story in whatever way feels right." A wave of gratitude washed over Daniel, and for the first time in days, he felt a genuine sense of hope. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." The man nodded and stood. "Take care of yourself, Daniel, and remember, the light will always be there, even when the shadows try to take over." As the man walked away, Daniel watched him disappear down the street, his silhouette fading into the morning light. He sat by the fountain for a while longer, letting the quiet of the town seep into his bones. Then, with a renewed sense of purpose, he stood and made his way back to the Gilded Lily. He packed his belongings, including the sketch pad and the amulet, and left the room that had been both his sanctuary and his prison. The innkeeper waved him off with a warm smile and a promise that he was always welcome should he ever return. The train station was nearly empty when he arrived, the platform bathed in soft sunlight. He purchased a ticket for the next train out of town, destination unknown. As he waited, he opened his sketch pad and began to draw. The lines flowed effortlessly, capturing the emotion and chaos of his journey, but also the light and hope that had guided him through. When the train pulled into the station, Daniel boarded and found a seat by the window. As the train began to move, he watched Ashthorn shrink into the distance, its rooftops and spires disappearing behind the hills. He didn't know where the train would take him, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that he had a future again, one free from the clutches of Carcosa. He had made his choice to live, to create, and to find meaning in the madness. As the train rumbled along the tracks, my friends, Daniel closed his eyes and smiled. Of the king in yellow. He wasn't running anymore. A story that leaves us questioning what's real and what's madness. If you enjoyed this journey into cosmic horror, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support motivates me to keep creating stories that intrigue, terrify, and leave you wanting more. Thanks for watching Mr. Vault Stories, and until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and beware of what lies beneath the surface.